Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra Kuf Mem Tes. Well, let's start on the bottom of Kuf Mem Ches Amar Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Gemara is discussing the case of a shlivmera. A shlivmera is a person who's lying in bed sick, and they think this person is concerned he's going to die, so he gives away all of his assets. So that is a special case that the rabbis say that if he recovers, the gift is reversible. But this only works if he gives away all of his assets. If he gives away a partial amount of his assets, then we say it's not a shliver gift. And so therefore, under those circumstances, the gift is not reversible. So Amar Rav Sheishes says, let's say he doesn't use the language of a gift. Let's say he just used the language of yitol or yizkeh or yachzik or yikneh. These are not specifically I'm giving to you as a gift, but it's similar words. So Rashi says, no, they all are the language of a gift. And so then it's a shlimera gift. And then we learned in the Brisa, even if you use the language of inherit, it's like a language of a gift. But only if that person was capable, was in line to inherit him, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka's teaching, that you could give it to somebody who's roy, who's in line to inherit you. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. So the Gemara asked a question on the top of 149a. The Gemara asked the question, Yahana behen mahu. Let's say he says, he doesn't say I'm giving to you, he says I want you to benefit from them. Is he saying that he wants to give it all to you so you can have totally it in your possession to get a benefit? Or maybe what he's saying is have a little bit of benefit from it. Yira ben mahu, Yamo ben mahu, Yishan ben mahu. Let's say he says, I want you to be seen with them or to stand up with them or to be supported by them. In all these cases, what's the halacha? And the Gemara leaves this question unresolved. Teiku. Says the Gemara, Yibayalahu Mecher Kol Nechasav. Let's say a person does not give away all of his assets, but he sells all of his assets. And that's what the Gemara's question. And now, presumably, now that he's recovered, he wants to undo the sale. So do we say just like for a gift, it can be reversible also for a sale? Now, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, so one statement made by Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, it says, Im Amad Eino Choser, that if he recovers, the sale is not reversible. V'zimnin Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Im Amad Choser. Sometimes the statement was said that he said, if you recover, the sale is reversible. And they're not arguing that one circumstance is where the assets are, he still has them, he still has the money, and one is where he used it to pay off his debt. So which is which? So Rashbam says, if he still has the assets, then the sale is reversible because that's why he kept all the money there that he had sold it for, because he said, if I recover, I'll pay it back. And where he used it to pay off his debts, that shows if he recovers, it's not reversible. But the other commentaries, like the Rimagash, they say just the opposite. They say if he still has the assets with him, that's not reversible because that's like a shlimer rabba miktas. It's like he only gave away a portion of the gift. But if he used it to pay off all his debts, it means he got rid of everything. That means to say that then it's like a shlimer and it's reversible. So now we have the next question. Let's say a shlimera, this person is lying sick, and now he says, in his illness, he says, this money belongs to this person. He admits that he owes other people money. And now, even though we know that he has all these assets, he has the presumptive status, do we say that he's saying this because he admits it, and so therefore it belongs to the other person? Or do we say No, he's only saying it so that they won't think his sons have too much money. They won't make his sons take an oath to pay them back money. So the Shlimera, do we believe him when he says something about admission about money that he owes other people? So Tashma, Gemara has the following story to try and learn out the ruling from this. So this is the case of Isur Giyura. So this is the case of Isur, the convert. This is, Rashbam says, this is the same Isur that we learned about in Gemara and Ksubos, Chaf Gimel Amid Aleph, that Isur was one of the captors of Shmuel's daughter, and he fell in love with Shmuel's daughter, and he impregnated her, and then only afterwards did he convert. Now, so this offspring was Mari Bas Rachel. So therefore, this boy was conceived before he was Jewish, but he was born in a state of holiness, meaning Torah, so below Kedusha, Venoah B'Kedusha. So technically speaking, he's not a halachic heir of his father here, of Isur, because he was conceived before his father was Jewish. So now we go back to the case. The Isur Giyura Havale Tracer Alfe Zuze Beirava. So he had 12,000 zuz. Isur had 12,000 zuz deposited with Rava. And Rav Mari Beret and his son Rav Mari was Horaso Shalo B'Kedusha, V'leidaso B'Kedusha. He was conceived not in a state of holiness, and he was born in holiness. Ubei Rav Havi, and he was a yeshiva bachar. Why is he telling us this? That he was a yeshiva bachar means that he was a good person, and he wanted to give him the money. So Amar Rava, but he's not. But Rav Mari is not going to inherit his father because he's not a halachic heir. So he has to give it to him. But the money was deposited with Rava. So Rava said, Heichi nikninu. Rava said, how is he going to give it to him? Heichi nakninu Rav Mari lahani zizi. How is Rav Mari going to get this money? Ibi Yerusha, if you want to say he'll inherit it from his father, Isur, Rav Bar Yerusha. Well, guess what? He's not a person who's capable of inheritance. Even Matana, if you want to say he's going to get it as a gift, Matana Shlimara, Yerusha Shavi Rabbanan. If you want to say he's going to get it as a gift, that won't work either. Why? Because even Matana, it's not going to work as a gift because the gift of a Shlimara, the rabbis equated with an inheritance, meaning to say as follows: Kohecha de Isa b'Yerusha, Isa b'Matana. Kohecha de Leisa b'Yerusha, Leisa b'Matana. The whole concept of a Shlimara is a takana, is a reform the rabbis made. And the rabbis only instituted this reform in a case where the person was also, technically speaking, an heir. And so since Rav Mari is not an heir to anyone, so therefore he wouldn't be included within the takana that the rabbis made to allow a gift of a shlimera. So there's other ways to acquire money. Even Mashiach, if you have to pull it towards you, leisnu gabe. Well, guess what? He doesn't have the money, says Rabbi. How's he going to pull it? And Ibe Chalipin, and if you want to do what's called a exchange, he'll give him an object, and thereby that'll be symbolic, like he'll lift up a handkerchief. Noah coins cannot be acquired via chalipin. It's not a valid way of acquiring money. And iyagav karka, if you want to say you'll transfer the money by dint of land, he says basically, I'm going to sell you this land and thereby, or rent you this land and thereby acquire the money along with it. That's called by dint. That also won't work. Why? Because Isur had no land. He was poor. Some want to suggest that even though it's like not a big deal, they could just rent him, like we saw earlier in other Gemaras, the threshold of the house, basically the lintel, like very small amount, but people didn't want to start up with Rava. And even Mamad Shlashtan, and what about this other source that we saw back on, I think it was Kufl Mamad Beis, that you could transfer it in front of three people. That's the law that we saw before. That you could just transfer it and say the depositor could say to the person who's holding the deposit, just transfer it to this other person. Well, there we would have to be there. If he would call for me, I wouldn't come to him. And so therefore, we all have to be present. And so since I'm not present, then it's not going to work. So he's not able to get it from me. So Maske for Ravika, Braid Ravami, so Ravika, the son of Ravami, challenges Samai. Velodi, Isur, the Halan Zuze, Durav Marininu. Why doesn't Isur just admit it? And if he admits it and he's a Shlimera, we accept the admission. And that's a way of transferring the property, basically. So Velodi Isur, the Halan Zuze, Durav Marininu, Votninu Bodisa. That's a valid way that the rabbis instituted this admission. And once he suggested this in the base medrash, the Rashbam says the word went out, and everybody and they taught actually Isur how to make this argument. And so therefore, at that point, Nafak Udisa Mibe Isur. So Arahachi Nafak Udisa Mibe Isur. In the meantime, this claim went out from the house of Isur, and indeed that's what Isur did. He did this admission. So Ikbid Rava was very upset. Amar kam megmuri tanaso inchiyu mafsadili. He said, they taught my claim to other people, and they cost me money. They taught my claim to other people, and they cost me money. So why was Rava so upset? Isn't Rava a big tzaddik? Why is Rava upset if he's a big tzaddik? So the commentaries say, they want to just be the Rava wanted to give the money, but he wanted to do it as chesed. He didn't want to have to be obligated. But anyway, that's a powerful story. To me, the point of the story is not the point, but a point of the story is that Rava is this person who, on the one hand, has all this authority. He's the Gadol Ador, he's the Rosh Yeshiva, and Isur is this convert, and he has no heirs, he has no assets, but nevertheless, he was able to defeat Rava using a halachic argument. We see from here that halacha is not a plutocracy; it's a meritocracy. Whoever comes up with the best argument will be able to be victorious, and that's why Isur is able to defeat Rava in this argument. Now says the Gemara on the top of 149b. It said in the Mishnah that a shlimera, if he gives his gift, it's reversible. But if he leaves over a little bit of land, then it's no longer a shlimera gift. Then it's going to be called it's an irreversible gift. It's not a shlimera gift, because presumably his intent in leaving it over was he didn't think he was going to die. Why else would he keep something for himself? So shir karko kolshu matanaso kayemes. If he left over a little bit of land, then the gift is not reversible. It's an irreversible gift. So Gemara says vikama kolshu. What does it mean if he left over a little bit of land? Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, Karka Kadei Parnasa. So he left over a little bit of land to enough land to support himself. Presumably, that the fruits would be able to support him. And says Abaye, that's the purpose of the land. And says Abaye, excuse me, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav. Karka Kedei Parnasos. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says Metaltal Kedei Parnasos. It doesn't have to be land to be able to support him, but just even movables to be able to support him from these fields, presumably even movable. It doesn't have to be specifically real estate. Namar Rabbi Zera Kama Mekuvnin Shmaita Tesabi. He says, look how precise the teachings of these elders are. Karka, as relates to land, taimamai, what's the reasoning that where if he left over land, he's not going to be able to reverse it? Because the reason is that the reason why if he left over land, it's considered an irreversible gift is because he's hedging his bets that if he recovers, he'll be able to rely on it. And so therefore he showed that it's a complete gift because he held something back for himself. The same concept is by metaltal nami ikai samachal. So therefore, it doesn't just mean land; it means even movables, and it's the reasoning because if he left behind the movables, it means that it's enough to sustain him, presumably for a year. So I said the Rosh says uh, that basically the concept is enough to sustain him and his household for a year. So now the Gemara says Rav Yosef does not like this position that Rabbi Zera said. Look how precise these elders are, because actually they're not precise. They're the opposite of precise. They're not precisely reading the text. So Maska for Rav Yosef, my kavanta. I don't understand. Why did you say that they're so precise? Manda Amar Metalto, and the one who says it's movable, he's not precise. Karka Tanan, our Mishnah said it has to be real estate. And Manda Amar Kedei Parnas also, and the one who says enough to support you, a kol tanan. It doesn't say enough to support you. It says any amount. So therefore, it's not that Rav Yosef is arguing with what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, or what Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said, but he just doesn't think that the proper description of their words is that they're precise. So now the Gemara says, Abaye introduces something. Amrle Abaye, do you mean to say, according to the first approach, when it says karka, Rav Yehuda, Rav says it literally needs to be karka, it needs to be real estate. Whereas Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says it could even be movables. So Abaye is going to say, when it says karka, when it says land in general, does it specifically mean land, or can it mean other things as well? So it says Abaye, karka dafka. When, according to the first approach, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav that whenever it says real estate, here it means actually real estate. In general, when it says real estate, doesn't mean specifically real estate, v'atanan. But that we have a Mishnah in Peah. The Mishnah also appears in Gittin. We had it in Gittin, and Peah we didn't have the Bavli on it, but this is a Mishnah from Peah. And the Mishnah says, "Hakosav kol nechasav avdo." The Mishnah is discussing how a person will free his aved. Hakosav kol nechasav avdo. Yatza ben chorim. A person who writes all of his assets to his slave goes free, because basically he says, I'm giving my slave all my assets, so that includes the slave, so the slave goes free. Balet, he says, I'm writing all my assets to my slave, but shiar karka kol shehu, but he says, I'm leaving over a kol shehu, any amount of real estate, then lo yatza ben chorin, then the slave has not gone free. Why not? Because presumably the karka here, as we'll see from the proof, does not mean specifically karka. It could also include eved. It could also include slave. And this proves that when it says karka, it doesn't just mean karka. It can mean an eved. It's a question on Rabbi Yehuda Marav. Before we get to that, we get to the answer for that, Rabbi Shimon says, "La'olam hu ben chorin," the slave will always be free. Ad sheyomar kol nechosai nesun laponi avdi chutz mi'echa miribo shebehen. Meaning to say, he's free if he says, I'm giving all my assets to my slave, unless he says, I'm giving it except for one small amount. Because if he leaves over anything, then it could be including the slave. Meaning to say, so Rabbi Shimon is saying, even though if he says real estate, that just means real estate. But if he says anything, then that could include the slave. But we see, according to the Tanakama, if he says real estate, it doesn't just mean real estate, it could also mean the slave. Amar Rav Yosef, and we're on top of 150. What? No, that's the position of Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon is saying that Rabbi Shimon is saying that if it says the land, it means the land and not the slave. So, but the Tanakhama is saying that land means slave. So that's a question. Amrav Dimi Bar Yosef Amrav Elazar. Also metaltun shiur etzel eved. Well, also metaltun shiur etzel ksuva. So Rav Dimi Bar Yosef says in the name of Rebbe Elazar that even though that they made metaltun would be a shiur etzel eved, meaning to say, we'll read the Rashbam. Afagav the Katani Shir Karka Kol Shehu, even though the position of the Tanakhama is if you left over a little bit of real estate, then he will not go free because we assume the slave is included in it. And it's the same thing, and it's the same law if he left over a little bit of movables, according to everybody. The avdi nami metalto dami, because the slave is also considered a movable, he's not attached to the ground. And people call him a movable. So we see from here, so even though it says if you left over the real estate, the slave goes free, it's not just real estate, it's also the slave. And uh, our Mishnah also is basically, that's the proof. Metaltalin is like move real estate enough to support for a year. So it says of Din Bar Yosef in the name of Rebbe Lazar, Asu metaltalin shir etzel aved, that if you left the movables over, we said basically the slave is not going to go free. Below also metaltalin shir etzel ksuba, but we don't. And this is not really relevant to the question, but he's just saying a statement. But we don't consider the movables a shiur with respect to the ksuva. This is something that we had earlier in our Gemara. We had a case where a person says, I'm selling all my assets except for one piece of real estate. Then we assume that the woman has not waived her right to the ksuba because she assumes that she's going to get that collection from that ksuba, from that piece of real estate. But if we just left the thing over movables, then it wouldn't be the case. So basically, this was the Mishnah in Peyad says a person who transferred all of his assets to his children, and then he says, I'm giving to my wife a little bit of real estate, and the woman was quiet, so she lost the rest of her ksuba because we say that she was saying, I'm not collecting that ksuba because I'm going to collect it from the real estate. But that's only by real estate. But where he says to her, I'm giving to you movables, then the woman has not waived the rights on the rest of her ksuba. So that's a specific case with respect to a ksuba and a woman. But anyway, we see from here that according to the Rabbanon, even though it says karka, it refers to a slave. So this is a question on the ruling of Rav Yehuda Amarav. But anyway, we also see that from the position of Rebbe Lazar, that when he says that they said metaltalum shir etzel eved, that if you left the metaltalum over by the slave, that even though the Mishnah says shir karka kolshu, it doesn't mean specifically real estate, but it's also the case for metaltalum. So we learned that from Rebbe Lazar's position, and so therefore we should say that our Mishnah, when it says shir karka, it should also include movables. So that's how you can read the question that way. So the Gemara, we can look at the Rashbam. So the Gemara says, no, this case is different. Gemara says this case is different. Gemara says, Hasam bedinu dulois nekarke. So the Gemara says, no. There in the Mishnah, with respect to somebody who says, I'm giving all my assets to my slave, there really, the Tana did not need to mention real estate because it would be the same thing if he left over movables. It would be considered like he left over the slave. And what's the reason? The only reason why it mentions real estate is because karaka is mentioned in the first clause. It didn't need to mention real estate. It could have mentioned movables. So it's different than our case here. Because what does the first clause in the Mishnah and Peah say? Rabbi Akiva Omer Karka Kolshu Chayeves Bepeah. There needs to be specifically real estate because Rabbi Akiva teaches us certain specific laws about real estate. Any amount of real estate, you have to take the mitzvah of Peah. You have to leave over a corner of the field. Ubikurim. Any amount of the first fruits, any amount of real estate, you're chayev in the mitzvah of bringing the fruits. And that if you have any spot, remember we learned about the law of prusbul that you need to be a real estate owner in order for the prusbul to work, and so therefore, if the borrower has real estate, it works, but he only has to have a little bit of amount. And you could use any amount of real estate as a method of acquisition of money and other movable objects, because by dint of the real estate, you can acquire it. And the kesef l'shtar v'chazaka, and you can use it to acquire those objects through real estate, through money, or with a presumptive status. So, I mean, say when you acquire the real estate with money, shtar and chazaka, you could also acquire the money, the coins. And mishum hachi katani karka. So that's why in the first clause it mentions real estate. So also in the second clause they mentioned that if you say I'm giving the slave, if you say I'm freeing the slave, all my assets to the slave, except for the real estate, it could also include the slave. But it doesn't necessarily mean specifically. It doesn't necessarily specifically mean that it only applies to real estate, even though the same law also applies to movables. And we don't know what the other case in other cases, we don't know if real estate means movables or not. Okay, so I just want to say that this idea that you just need a small piece of land and you could do all these mitzvahs. There's a person in Israel. He's selling people a little bit of land, a very small amount, so they could acquire all these mitzvahs from the Torah that are dependent upon land. Anyway, I will stop the recording here. Shkoyach.